Martha had always been the type of person who thrived in the company of others. She enjoyed hosting dinner parties, organizing family get-togethers, and attending social events with friends. Her life was filled with the hustle and bustle of daily interactions, a never-ending rhythm of conversation and laughter. Whether she was making a fresh batch of cookies for her grandchildren or meeting her neighbors for a cup of tea, there was always something happening in her world. She loved that about life, its unpredictability and its connections. But when Henry, her husband of 42 years, passed away, something began to change in the space she once considered her home. At first, there were the funeral arrangements, the visits from friends, and the steady stream of phone calls and sympathy cards. People brought food, flowers, and words of comfort. But as the weeks passed, the calls slowed down and the visits became less frequent. The silence that followed felt heavy, more oppressive than she had ever imagined. Martha had always been independent, managing the household and taking care of Henry in his later years as he became frailier. But now, she found herself alone in the house they had built together, the walls filled with memories but devoid of the lively conversations that once filled them. The silence was not only in the house, but within her as well, like a quiet storm that she couldn't quite understand. It was as though the fabric of her life had unraveled, and she had no idea how to put it back together. At first, Martha tried to ignore it. She told herself that it was normal to feel sad and isolated after such a loss. After all, she was getting older, and with age, people tended to lose some of their social connections. Her children, though grown and with their own families, checked in occasionally. But their busy lives meant they couldn't be there every day, and even when they were, it felt like they were more focused on their own worlds than on hers. Her son, Greg, lived in another state, and although he called every few days, it wasn't the same as having him close by. Her daughter, Lucy, lived in the city, but her work schedule left little room for visits. They would talk on the phone, but those conversations often revolve around their own families, their jobs, and the mundane details of daily life. Martha didn't want to burden them with her loneliness, so she kept the feelings to herself, pushing them deeper inside. She had always been the one to take care of others, not the one who needed taking care of. Still, the empty spaces in her home couldn't be ignored. The quiet was unbearable sometimes, like a thick fog that hung around her, clouding her thoughts. It was subtle at first, the absence of Henry's footsteps, the lack of his voice calling from the other room. But soon, it became more pronounced. The stillness of her surroundings began to seep into her mind, and Martha found herself retreating more and more into herself. The television became her constant companion. She'd turn it on in the morning, the noise filling the silence, but she hardly paid attention to what was on the screen. She would sit in her favorite armchair, staring blankly at the television, the flickering images offering no real solace. Her mind wandered, drifting from one thought to another, but always returning to the same conclusion. This wasn't how she imagined life after Henry. She had always assumed that they would grow old together, sitting side by side in their garden, talking about their past, their children, and their grandchildren. But that future had vanished, and in its place was an endless stream of solitary days. Her routine became predictable. She would wake up early, have a cup of coffee, and then spend the day doing small chores around the house. She'd water the plants, clean the windows, and dust the furniture, tasks that once felt comforting now seemed almost pointless. She found herself staring at the clock, counting the hours until it was time for bed. The nights were the worst. The darkness in the house seemed to deepen, and the weight of the quiet became almost suffocating. She tried to occupy herself with hobbies, reading, knitting, even gardening, but nothing seemed to bring the joy it once did. There was no one to share it with. When she did manage to talk to a friend or family member, she would tell them that she was doing just fine, that she was adjusting to the changes in her life. But deep down, she knew she wasn't fine. She had grown accustomed to being surrounded by people, and now the solitude was unbearable. It wasn't just the lack of conversation that bothered her. It was the lack of meaning. Before Henry's passing, everything had a purpose: raising children, maintaining a home, planning for the future. Now, each day felt like it was stretching endlessly, with no real reason to look forward to anything. There were no more shared plans, no more dreams of the future. She had lost the connection that had anchored her for so long. Martha's world became smaller and smaller. She started to feel invisible, as if no one really saw her anymore. Her friends had their own families to focus on, and although they still cared, the dynamics had shifted. She felt like an afterthought. The few times she ventured out to the grocery store or the post office, she would put on a smile, but it was an empty smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. People were polite, but no one really asked how she was doing. No one really noticed. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of silence, Martha sat down at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the garden that Henry had always tended so carefully. She thought about all the things they had done together, the vacations, the late-night talks, the quiet mornings with a cup of coffee. The sadness she felt was overwhelming, but what struck her even more was the gnawing emptiness inside her. She realized she was no longer just grieving Henry's death. She was grieving the loss of a life filled with connections, with love, and with meaning. She had heard about the effects of loneliness on older adults, how it could lead to depression, anxiety, and even physical illness. But at the time, it seemed like something that happened to other people, not her. She was strong, wasn't she? She had always been resilient, able to bounce back from adversity. Yet, as the days wore on, Martha began to notice small changes in herself. She felt tired all the time, even though she wasn't doing anything that should have worn her out. She found it harder to concentrate, her mind often wandering and struggling to stay focused. She was forgetful, forgetting names and dates, losing track of time. It was as though her brain was slowing down, weighed down by the constant undercurrent of isolation. Martha had never been one to shy away from challenges, but this loneliness felt different. It wasn't something she could simply solve with a phone call or a visit from a friend. It was deeper, more insidious. She had heard that loneliness could actually alter the brain, affecting its ability to function. But she didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to think that the loneliness she felt was physically changing her in ways she couldn't reverse. But as time went on, she realized that the silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was an absence of connection, an absence of purpose. It was a slow erosion of the person she once was, the vibrant, engaged woman who had thrived on the relationships she had built over the years. One evening, as she sat in the dimly lit living room, Martha picked up her phone and dialed her daughter's number. As the phone rang, she wondered if Lucy would pick up. And when she did, Martha's heart lifted slightly. They talked for a while about Lucy's kids, about the upcoming holidays, about how things are going in her life. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it was enough to remind Martha that she was still part of something, still connected to the world outside her home. But as the call ended, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change. She didn't know what it was yet, but she knew that living in this silence, this isolation, couldn't continue. It was affecting her mind, her body, and her spirit. She needed to find a way out, a way to reclaim the life that seemed so far out of reach. But first, she had to admit to herself that the loneliness had taken a toll, and that acknowledging it was the first step toward healing. For several months after Henry's passing, Martha had tried to convince herself that the loneliness she felt was a normal part of life. She had expected some grief and sadness, of course, but she also thought that the passage of time would heal her wounds. She had lived a long and full life, after all, and she understood that change was inevitable. However, as the months dragged on and the absence of Henry's presence in their home seemed to grow larger, Martha began to notice something more troubling. The loneliness wasn't just an emotional feeling. It was starting to manifest in her body and her mind in ways she couldn't ignore. It wasn't that she wasn't trying to stay active or engaged. Martha made an effort each day to maintain her usual routine, to push through the fog of sadness and isolation. She kept herself busy by tending to her garden, cleaning the house, reading books, and going for occasional walks around the neighborhood. But the longer she lived in solitude, the more apparent it became that these activities, while keeping her physically occupied, were not enough to counteract the growing weight of emotional isolation. At first, Martha could still feel the sharpness of her mind, the clarity she had always prided herself on. She had been a teacher for over 30 years, and sharp thinking and mental agility had always been part of who she was. But slowly, it started to feel as though her mind was working against her. She couldn't quite pinpoint when it started, but one day, as she was talking to her daughter, Lucy, she realized that she couldn't remember the name of the restaurant they had visited last year on their trip to the coast. It was a small detail, but it lingered with her. When she had been active and engaged with others, her mind had been quick, able to recall information with ease. Now, as she tried to reach for the name of that restaurant, she found that the mental block frustrated her, almost as much as it frightened her. It was only after a few similar incidents, forgetting names of acquaintances, losing her train of thought in the middle of a conversation, that Martha allowed herself to acknowledge what was happening. Her mind, once sharp and focused, was becoming clouded, slower. She had read about how loneliness and social isolation could impact memory and cognitive function in older adults, but she hadn't thought it would happen to her. She always considered herself healthy, mentally and physically, a person who prided herself on her independence and ability to cope with the inevitable challenges of life. But now, she was confronted with something that she hadn't anticipated: the slow, creeping deterioration of her mind. One evening, as Martha sat in her armchair, a glass of water in hand, she tried to read the newspaper. But as she flipped through the pages, her focus began to drift. The words blurred, her eyes skimming the sentences without really processing the information. She put the paper down and tried to think of something else to do, but she couldn't settle on anything. Her mind felt restless, disjointed, and the quiet in the house seemed louder than ever. What scared her most was that she didn't know how to fix it. She had always believed that staying busy, engaging with others, and keeping a positive outlook on life were the keys to maintaining both physical and mental health. But now, none of that seemed to be working. She had even started to avoid phone calls from friends, not wanting to admit that she was struggling. The loneliness was becoming a physical presence, creeping into her joints, settling into the bones, sapping her energy. As she lay in bed one night, staring up at the ceiling, the thought hit her: could loneliness be affecting her health in more ways than she realized? Martha had read articles in the past about the effects of isolation on the elderly, but she had never paid much attention to the details. After all, it seemed to be something that happened to other people, not her. She had a good life, good health, and had always stayed active. But as she reflected on how much time she had spent in isolation recently, she started to understand the true danger of solitude. Her suspicions were confirmed when she decided to research the issue further. One evening, she spent hours reading about how chronic loneliness affects the brain and body, particularly in older adults. She learned that prolonged social isolation could lead to a host of problems: memory loss, depression, anxiety, and even cognitive decline. The brain, deprived of regular interaction and stimulation, begins to atrophy, its neural connections weakening over time. It wasn't just a matter of feeling sad or lonely. It was a biological process that could seriously impact her health. She read about how loneliness raised levels of stress hormones, which, in turn, led to higher blood pressure, a weakened immune system, and an increased risk of conditions like dementia. The research was clear. Loneliness was a silent killer, capable of affecting every part of a person's well-being. The more Martha read, the more she realized that her forgetfulness, her fatigue, and her increasing sense of isolation were symptoms of a larger problem. She had thought that the sadness would eventually fade, that time would heal her wounds. But now, she saw that loneliness wasn't something that simply passed with time. It had the power to change the way her brain functioned, and she had already begun to feel its effects. What troubled her even more was the realization that she was not alone in her experience. In fact, studies showed that millions of older adults around the world suffered from loneliness, and many of them experienced similar cognitive and emotional symptoms. It was a vicious cycle. Loneliness led to depression, which in turn made people even more isolated, further exacerbating the problem. Martha had always prided herself on being strong, but now, in the quiet moments of her days, she couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. She realized that if she didn't act soon, the effects of isolation might become irreversible. It wasn't just about feeling sad anymore. It was about preserving the mental sharpness and emotional resilience that had always been part of her identity. She couldn't afford to let loneliness take any more from her. But the question remained, what could she do about it? Martha knew she needed to make changes, but she had no idea where to start. She couldn't just keep going through the motions of daily life, pretending everything was fine. The first step, she realized, was acknowledging the truth of her situation. She was lonely, and it was affecting her health in ways she couldn't ignore. It wasn't easy to admit that she needed help, but Martha knew that the first step toward regaining her sense of well-being was to ask for it. She had always been the one offering support, not the one seeking it. But now, for the sake of her own health, she had to reach out. Martha picked up the phone and called her daughter, Lucy. "Hi, sweetie," Martha said, her voice a little shaky. "I've been doing some reading, and I think I need to make some changes. I can't keep living like this." Lucy, who had noticed her mother's increasing isolation in recent months, was immediately supportive. "What do you mean, Mom? How can I help?" Martha hesitated for a moment before responding. "I don't think I'm doing okay. It's more than just missing your dad. It's the loneliness. It started to affect my mind, my health. I can't just keep pretending everything's fine." Lucy was quiet for a moment, then gently said, "You're not alone, Mom. We'll figure this out together. Let's come up with a plan to get you more connected, to help you feel better." For the first time in months, Martha felt a glimmer of hope. Her daughter's words reminded her that she wasn't alone in this fight. There were ways to combat loneliness, and she was ready to take the first step. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and there would be days when the silence felt overwhelming. But she had to try, before the loneliness took even more from her. It had taken months, but Martha finally understood the magnitude of the toll that loneliness was taking on her life. After weeks of grappling with foggy thoughts and emotional exhaustion, she could no longer ignore the creeping sense of isolation that had overtaken her. The grief of losing Henry was undeniable, but the slow descent into solitude had left its mark in more ways than she had initially realized. Her body, once strong and capable, had become lethargic. Her mind, once sharp, had become clouded. Even the quiet comfort she had once found in her own company had been replaced with restlessness and anxiety. But now, she had made the most difficult decision of all. It was time to do something about it. Martha had spent so many months allowing the silence to grow louder, letting the days blend into one another in a haze of inertia. She had convinced herself that she could handle it, that it was just a phase she needed to weather. But as she sat at the kitchen table, the phone in her hand and her daughter's reassuring voice still echoing in her mind, she knew that the time for waiting had passed. She had to fight back. Martha had always been a strong woman. She had raised 2 children, supported her husband through years of sickness, and made it through challenges that would have broken others. She was used to taking care of others, not the other way around. But now, she understood that caring for herself was just as important. And the first step in that self-care was to admit that she needed help. The next morning, she woke up early, as she always did, and went about her usual routine. But there was something different in her actions that day. There was a newfound resolve in the way she made her bed, the way she set her coffee cup down on the counter. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She was preparing herself for change. She knew it wouldn't be easy. In fact, she feared it might be the hardest thing she had ever done. But she had to begin. She picked up her phone and called her daughter, Lucy, right away. The conversation they had the night before had given her the courage to take the first steps. Lucy had listened to her, offering gentle but firm encouragement. "You're not alone in this, Mom," she had said. "We'll figure it out together. But you have to take the first step. Don't try to do it all at once. Start small. I'll be here with you every step of the way." It was exactly what Martha needed to hear. Over the years, she had learned that when she needed support, she could always rely on Lucy. She had been there for her when Henry had fallen ill, helping her navigate the overwhelming responsibilities of caregiving. And now, Lucy was here again, helping her navigate the much more daunting responsibility of caring for herself. After their phone call, Martha began to create a plan. She took out a piece of paper and wrote down 5 key things she wanted to focus on. The first was simple: reconnect with others. She realized that for far too long, she had closed herself off from the world. She hadn't returned calls from friends, hadn't attended social gatherings, and had even turned down invitations to dinner. She had isolated herself, believing that the more she withdrew, the less painful the emptiness would be. But now, she saw that the opposite was true. Isolation was only deepening her sense of despair. It was time to break the silence and open the door to the world again. Her second goal was to exercise regularly. Martha had always enjoyed walking, and she loved spending time in the garden. But in recent months, even these simple pleasures had fallen by the wayside. She had become too tired, too lethargic to take care of herself physically. But research had shown her that physical exercise was not only beneficial for the body, but also for the brain. It could help reduce stress, improve mood, and increase cognitive function. It wasn't just about staying in shape. It was about giving her mind the boost it needed. The third item on her list was to engage in something creative. Martha had always loved to write, though she hadn't written much since Henry had passed. She had written poetry when she was younger, and the idea of returning to that creative outlet filled her with a sense of purpose. Writing, she knew, was a way to express her emotions, to process her grief, and to reconnect with the part of herself that had been so deeply buried under the weight of loneliness. Her fourth goal was to volunteer. Martha had always been the kind of person who believed in giving back. When she was a teacher, she had always taken on extra duties to help students who were struggling. After Henry's passing, she had found herself becoming more and more withdrawn from her community, but she knew that now was the time to reconnect. Volunteering would not only give her a sense of purpose, but also allow her to meet new people and form new social bonds. It was a way to step out of the isolation that had overtaken her life and contribute to something greater than herself. Finally, Martha wrote down one last item on her list: seek professional help if necessary. She had never been one to seek therapy, believing that she could handle things on her own. But now, she realized that there was no shame in asking for help when needed. It was clear that her emotions were tangled up in her grief and loneliness, and it would be helpful to speak to a professional who could help her navigate the complex layers of her feelings. She wasn't sure if it was something she would need right away, but it was comforting to know that it was an option. With her plan in hand, Martha sat back in her chair, feeling both nervous and excited. The truth was, she was terrified. Terrified that she might fail, terrified that her efforts might be too little, too late. But she knew that if she didn't try, if she didn't take action, she would only sink deeper into the very loneliness that had already taken so much from her. The first step was easy: reconnecting with others. Martha made a list of friends she hadn't spoken to in months, some even in years, and she began dialing their numbers. At first, her voice trembled as she picked up the phone, but she pushed through the anxiety. "Hi, Margaret, it's Martha. I know it's been a while, but I've been thinking about you and wanted to check in. How are you?" It was a simple conversation, but it was the first time in months that she had opened herself up to someone else. To her surprise, Margaret was thrilled to hear from her, and the conversation quickly turned to laughter and shared memories. It felt like a weight had been lifted from Martha's shoulders as they caught up on each other's lives. The next step was exercise. Martha laced up her sneakers the next morning and went for a walk around the neighborhood. At first, her legs felt stiff, and she could only manage a slow pace. But as she walked, the air felt fresher, and with each step, she felt a little lighter. By the end of the walk, she was out of breath but proud of herself. She had done it. She had moved her body, something she hadn't done in far too long. In the following days, she added more walks to her routine, and eventually, she enrolled in a local fitness class for seniors. It was a small step, but it was a significant one for her. The class gave her the structure she needed, and it also allowed her to meet other people in her community. Martha also began writing again. She pulled out her old journal and started to jot down her thoughts and feelings. Some of it was about Henry, some about the loneliness she had been feeling, and some about the small victories she had achieved in the past few days. It didn't matter what she wrote, only that she was writing. Finally, Martha contacted a local community center and signed up to volunteer. The idea of helping others and becoming involved in something greater than herself gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She began helping with a literacy program for adults, tutoring people who were learning to read. It was something she had always loved to do, and it reminded her of the joy she had found in teaching throughout her career. As the weeks went by, Martha began to see the fruits of her efforts. She felt more energized, more connected to the world around her. The loneliness, though still present at times, had lessened. She had opened herself up to new experiences, and in doing so, she had opened herself up to new possibilities. But there was one thing that Martha realized. This journey wasn't going to be linear. Some days would be better than others, and there would be setbacks along the way. But for the first time in a long while, she felt that she was heading in the right direction. She was fighting back, not just against loneliness, but against the sense of helplessness that had once overtaken her. And as she continued on this path, one step at a time, Martha knew that the most important part of her journey was not about overcoming loneliness entirely. It was about learning to live with it, to find new ways to cope, and to embrace the beauty of connection, however imperfect it might be. As Martha stood in her garden, the golden light of late afternoon filtering through the leaves of the tall oak tree in the corner, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. Just a few months ago, she had been a shell of herself, consumed by grief and loneliness. The house, once filled with laughter and the hum of daily life, had felt unbearably empty. The silence had been oppressive, its weight heavy on her shoulders. But now, as she carefully pruned the rose bushes that Henry had loved so much, Martha realized that she had taken control of her life again. The journey hadn't been easy. There were moments when the old ache of loss threatened to pull her back into the abyss of isolation. But she had fought back, step by step, and she had discovered something crucial along the way: the power of connection, the value of self-compassion, and the importance of allowing herself to be vulnerable. Her efforts had begun to bear fruit in ways she hadn't expected. The regular exercise was paying off, not just physically, but mentally as well. She felt stronger, more energetic. The walks she took around the neighborhood, the yoga classes she had joined, the time she spent tending to her garden, all of it had reinvigorated her. She had even joined a small local book club, a suggestion from her daughter, Lucy. It had felt like a leap at first, sitting in a circle with strangers, discussing a book she hadn't read in years. But over time, it had become a cherished part of her routine. The conversations, the laughter, and the shared interest in literature had given her a sense of belonging that she hadn't realized she was missing. But it was the connections with people that truly helped Martha rebuild. Margaret, the old friend she had called out of the blue, had become a steady presence in her life again. The two of them had started meeting regularly for coffee, catching up on old times and talking about their families, their health, their fears, and their hopes. There was a healing power in those simple conversations, a power that made Martha feel less alone in the world. And then there was the volunteering. It had started out as something she thought she should do, a way to fill the emptiness and find purpose. But it had turned into something much more than that. The literacy program for adults had allowed Martha to rediscover her love for teaching and had given her a sense of accomplishment she had long missed. She had never imagined that, at this stage in her life, she would be able to make such an impact on others. The students she worked with were a diverse group. Some were immigrants trying to learn English, while others were older adults working on basic reading skills. But no matter their background, they all shared a desire to better themselves, and Martha found joy in helping them reach their goals. The sense of gratitude she felt each time a student succeeded, even in the smallest of ways, filled her with pride and renewed purpose. It wasn't just the big steps, like volunteering or joining the book club. that had changed Martha's life. It was the little things, too. The phone calls to friends she had let slip away. The quiet mornings when she sipped her coffee on the porch, watching the birds flit about, feeling the sun warm her skin. The time she spent with Lucy and her family, playing board games and laughing around the dinner table. Slowly, all these small moments had added up, and Martha found that she was no longer overwhelmed by the silence that had once felt so suffocating. It was still there, of course, but it had become a part of the rhythm of her life, something she could manage rather than something that controlled her. But it wasn't just the external connections that had brought her peace, it was the work she had done on herself. In the months following her decision to take control, Martha had realized that healing wasn't just about finding new friends or filling her schedule with activities. It was about learning to be kind to herself, to embrace her own company, and to allow herself to grieve without guilt. For the longest time, Martha had resisted the idea of therapy. She had always believed that she could handle things on her own, that her independence and resilience were enough to see her through any challenge. But after months of struggling with her emotions, she had taken the step of seeking professional help. At first, she had felt nervous, unsure of what to expect. But her therapist, Sarah, had been patient and empathetic. In their sessions, Martha had begun to untangle the complex emotions that had held her captive: grief, guilt, fear, and loneliness. Sarah had helped her understand that it was okay to feel sad and that there was no shame in seeking help. Martha had learned to accept that her journey toward healing would be ongoing, but that didn't mean she had to face it alone. One of the most important lessons Sarah had taught her was the idea of self-compassion. Martha had always been hard on herself, holding herself to impossibly high standards. But learning to forgive herself, to treat herself with the same kindness she showed to others, had been transformative. It was this newfound compassion that had allowed her to see her own worth, even in the midst of her pain. The change in Martha had been profound. Where there had once been a woman consumed by grief and loneliness, there was now someone who had rediscovered the joy of living. It wasn't that the sadness had disappeared entirely. Henry's absence still lingered in her heart, and there were moments when the grief would resurface uninvited. But Martha had learned to carry it with her, rather than letting it define her. She had found a way to live with the loss, to make room for both the joy and the sorrow. One afternoon, as Martha sat on the porch of her house, sipping her tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon, Lucy arrived with her grandchildren. The familiar sound of their laughter filled the air, and Martha smiled as they ran around the yard, chasing each other and playing games. It had been a long time since she had felt this kind of peace, this sense of belonging. It was in these moments that Martha understood what she had learned: the importance of connection, not just to others, but to herself. Lucy sat beside her mother, her voice soft and comforting. "Mom, I'm so proud of you," she said. "You've come so far." Martha smiled, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you, sweetie. I needed your help to see that there was more to life than just the silence." Lucy took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We all need help sometimes, Mom, but you're stronger than you think." Martha nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I've learned that the only way out of loneliness is through it," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And sometimes you have to make the effort to reach out, even when it feels easier to stay in the dark. I've been in that dark place for so long, but now I see the light again." The next morning, Martha woke up with a sense of purpose. The phone rang, and as she answered it, her friend Margaret's familiar voice greeted her. The two of them made plans to meet for lunch, something that had become a cherished routine. Martha didn't think about the silence as much anymore. It was still there, but it no longer held the power it once had. It was a quiet companion, a part of her life that she had come to accept, even embrace. Martha's journey had taught her many things. She had learned that loneliness could erode the very foundation of her health, but she had also learned that it didn't have to define her. The path to healing wasn't always linear, and there were setbacks along the way. But with each step forward, no matter how small, Martha had come to understand the power of resilience, connection, and self-compassion. As the weeks passed, Martha continued to grow stronger, emotionally, mentally, and physically. She didn't expect that loneliness would ever fully disappear, but she knew that she had the tools to cope with it, to live alongside it without letting it control her. The emptiness she had once feared was no longer a threat. It was simply a part of the landscape of her life. In the end, Martha realized that it wasn't about finding a cure for loneliness, but about learning how to live with it and still find joy. And as she watched her grandchildren play in the yard, her heart swelled with gratitude for the life she had lived, the lessons she had learned, and the love that still surrounded her, both from others and from within herself.